Do you support America's operations or not? Because you either need to stick with your rhetoric and follow through on that, be consistent in the narrative that your criticism, or shut up and it's a frustration of difference between narrative and action.
The reality is that every nation, including my own, has to balance a lot of different things, whether it's domestic concerns, regional concerns. It was not a given that the U.S. would support Great Britain in the Falklands because the Reagan administration was trying very hard to improve relationship with all of our neighbors in South America. I mean, that required some work for the Americans to be not support, but at least not block Great Britain UK doing what it did in the Falklands. These kind of things are not unusual where you're having to do things. You don't want to advertise everything that you are doing. Now, I will say this current administration has a real problem with talking too much about classified information and what's going on. I think it was appropriate that UK was not advertising what they were doing to support.
This is The Global Gambit.
Well, welcome back, General Hodges. Thank you very much for joining the program once again. I wanted to get very quickly an overview of your thoughts over the latest developments on the battlefield of Ukraine. I'd like to go into some of the developments we're seeing around, of course, America's operations in Venezuela and what that means for the Russians. But let's keep it closer to home with Ukraine right now. We've seen advances to Kupiansk, we've seen the retaking of it, we've seen Putin's reclaimed that it's been claimed again. How do you look at the battlefield at the moment?
Well, a lot's happened since the last time we talked, but not much has changed. Interestingly enough, the Russians still fail to make any meaningful gains. As you will have probably seen in Philip O'Brien's recent piece, that at the cost of about 400,000 casualties, the Russians have gained 0.08 or 0.8 of 1% territory. That's according to the ISW, Institute for Study of War. That's incredible in a year. Now, of course, casualties don't matter to the Kremlin, but still, this is the idea that somehow Russian victory is inevitable. The facts don't support that. And that's why I think it's important that we take every opportunity to remind people that the Russians don't have the ability to overwhelm or overrun the Ukrainians or break through and then exploit it the way their grandfathers might have done. Now, of course, Ukraine is suffering casualties, but they've managed to stabilize the line of contact here over the last year and a half with effective use of drones and have less people at the line. Some people in the West have said you got to have more troops, you need to get them more up in the line where they just get killed. Instead, the Ukrainians have managed to create a sort of a zone where they don't have to have as many people there. They still have manpower problems, but it's not the way it's portrayed, in my view. That's the first big piece. The second big piece, of course, is that the Kremlin knows that they really can't overwhelm. So what they can do, though, is keep killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. So they're continuing this barrage night after night. Kyiv got hit hard last night, and the Ukrainians don't have enough air defense capabilities to stop all of that, at least not yet. So this is going to continue. You can't win a war doing that, but it makes it miserable for the Ukrainian people. And it also is, it can have an impact on the defense industry, which is an important part of this as well. So that's the second sort of thing. And then the third and final thing is I think that the Ukrainians have developed a theory of victory, which is destroy Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. If Russia's not able to sell enough oil and gas, and they are struggling right now, then I don't think they can finance the war. So it seems to me that Ukraine has adopted a good approach, and now Europe needs to be more helpful with stopping shadow fleet vessels in the Baltic Sea. And fortunately, it looks like the United States now, maybe for their own different reasons, but if the Trump administration is going after Russian tankers, that also helps.
Yes, I want to unpack the strategic elements of Russia's fallout and America's what we saw with the two tankers. I believe it was 2 days ago now.
Right.
In a moment on the tactical element a little bit more, because this is something that I get a lot of conflicting opinions on. So I want yours to add to the mix and maybe help clear it up for us, but experts like Michael Kaufman emphasize the importance of manpower and the deficit that the Ukrainians have. Others say that that is overstated and that things like drones and other automotive, whatever forms can sort of fill that gap. Do you agree with that? Or what's your stance on this? And is it a problem for obviously both sides, but particularly Ukraine?
Well, certainly Michael has got a lot to say and has pretty good analysis most of the time. But in this case, I don't see a benefit of putting more troops up in the line if the Russians are not able to break through what's there. Now, he probably, if he's talking about they need more troops, more depth so that you can rotate people better, I'm not against that. But the idea of having more troops on the line, all that really does is expose more people unnecessarily to what the Russians are able to do. So I think clearly they've got to fix their manning system by probably they can make better use of female soldiers, women, and also making sure that people that are eligible and should be recruited are getting recruited. I don't advocate changing the age thing. That this is a cultural and Ukrainian national thing, but they could be more efficient probably in getting women and men into uniform. But this is where the government, not the army, but the government has responsibility to earn the confidence and trust of families that their son or daughter or husband or brother or whoever is not going to be gone off to some Ukrainians refer to as the old prison army, the old Soviet style, but instead would be properly trained and equipped before they get deployed anywhere.
Yes. One last question on this specific element then, because one of the things that we seem to see is that the Ukrainians will give the Russians space. They'll retreat, incrementally give the Russians space, and then they'll push back and retake the land that has cost the Russians a lot of resources, time. It's all granular at the end of the day. But do you think that's one of the movements that is quite useful on the Ukrainians, like sort of tactical relocation or displacement and then retaking it? And what else would you be advising Ukraine to be doing over the next, I don't know, from as we enter the spring, the warmer months, more strikes further into Russia, focusing on supply chains? What would you think is there?
Well, certainly what works in Kupiansk might not work in Pokrovsk or might not work in somewhere else. We're talking about a long front. But I would point to the results. I mean, Pokrovsk, the Russians have been trying to take it for 18 months, and they still don't have it. They claimed they had Kupiansk, and then obviously President Zelensky pointed out that they haven't. And so I think the Ukrainians, they don't need my advice on what they should be doing different. What they do need is more long-range precision strike capability that would help them not only go after oil and gas, but also the Russian logistics, the rail, the transportation network. They're actually, it's interesting, as many or as big as Russia is and as much as it depends on rail to move, there actually are just a handful of choke points in this big network that if you could eliminate the choke point, then it would disrupt the whole thing. I'm pretty sure that Ukrainians, that the GUR knows where those are, and that if and when possible, they will strike there. But that's, to me,
Well, another operation spiderweb or something like that.
Something like that. I imagine they've got a lot of things on the drawing board, be my guess.
All right. So now if we move slightly broader, we've had obviously a lot of developments over Europe. I made a video myself recently emphasizing why Putin is targeting Europe now rhetorically, because they're getting in the way of his plans and it's frustrating him. But also now the French and the English, or the UK, have committed to, best way to call them, peacekeepers in the event of a ceasefire. Do you think that makes a difference? Or do you think the Europeans are trying to step up in a way that America is not now that Trump's getting more interested in the Western Hemisphere and stuff?
Well, the Russians launched this Oreshk missile yesterday that struck a gas storage facility near Lviv. And of course, that has an impact. But I spoke with a Ukrainian friend earlier today. And I said, what's the reaction of Ukrainians there to the Oreshk, which has got all these headlines, and it's supersonic, 10 times the speed of sound, nuclear capable. It sounds pretty ominous. And she said, actually, they're much more worried about Kinzhal missiles, that the Oreshk was something that was originally designed as an anti-ship missile. It doesn't actually, if it's carrying conventional warhead, it's not that big a deal. It is kind of, it's interesting, but for them, they're much more worried about Kinzhals. But so why would the Russians launch this thing that has such a reputation? It's psychological, exactly the point that you're making. It's to remind people, hey, we have nuclear capable weapons and we can launch this thing that you can't stop. And even if it doesn't make a really big hole somewhere, that's this is part of that psychological effort, because they want to scare European countries to deter them from wanting to support Ukraine directly or to be part of a security guarantee after whatever sort of settlement comes out. So this is the psychological part is integral to how the Russians do what they do. For us, we tend to, it's like an add-on. For them, it's integral. They're better at it than we are. And we always fall for it. Like, oh my God, they have a nuclear capable weapon. Well, no shit. We have thousands of nuclear capable weapons. But when you say nuclear capable, that just means this rocket can carry a nuclear warhead. But that's the likelihood of that happening is very close to zero. By constantly talking about it as nuclear capable, it sounds much more scary.
Well, I think we're on round 4 or 5 of threatened nuclear usage by the Kremlin. I remember the 22 one being very concerned. He said it 24 late last year as well. It seems to be an annual theme at this point, Ben, where Putin comes out and has his annual nuclear threat address, much like his Christmas address.
At least that's why, a couple of weeks ago, they made a big deal about we've just deployed the Oreshk truck, the launchers on, went to Belarus. Big deal. You don't have to go to Belarus to launch it. You could launch it. In fact, this one last night was launched from somewhere near Kazakhstan. The whole point is just to kind of keep it in the news. It's like, oh my God, they have a nuclear capable, and we fall for it every time.
Well, it reminds me very much of when the Russians launched hypersonics against Lviv when Biden was giving his initial address in Poland. I think it was in April of 22. So it's very much, they can use them whenever they want. They're also expensive. I don't think the cost of using them is that, but it doesn't make much sense. It's very costly to use them for these symbolic strikes, or do you think they're quite easy to manufacture?
I think you're probably right. I think from a purely military standpoint, do you get a real advantage to use it? And striking a gas storage facility is that the best target for your what's supposed to be like your super cool weapon? I don't know. I think it is mostly psychological.
So just on Europe, and one more question. So one of the things that frustrates me most about Europe is their seeming inability to get with the times. And what I mean by that is that there is still a sort of reaction. One of the things that I appreciate about Macron, it doesn't necessarily mean I like everything about him, is that he does say the things that I think need to be said. And one of them was that we need to talk to Putin. Now, this isn't me encouraging necessarily capitulation, but more in the sense of we have to command the narrative. We have to get out ahead of what the Kremlin is saying and be proactive. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's more, the politics is less important than the military angle and supporting the Ukrainians through hardware?
Well, I think you have to ask, what is the objective? Now, you and I have talked several times before, and it's still what's not clear. What is the strategic objective? What do we want? Just to stop the killing is not an objective, because that doesn't eliminate the reason that there is killing. So I think whatever European leaders are doing, the Americans, the Canadians, whatever we're doing, it needs to be tied to a strategic objective. Now, the Biden administration never did do a good job of this. They never said what the strategic outcome was. And because of that, you never get good policy. And I think what's been very unhelpful is that the Trump administration has been talking for a year, we're going to solve it in a year, we're going to get this done, and we've got a plan, and we're going to do all these things. And so European leaders who lack self-confidence kept waiting for Trump to deliver and do what he said he was going to do. And of course, he never did. And so I think most European leaders wasted an entire year because they kept believing when Trump would say, well, we'll make a decision in 2 weeks. I'm going to put huge sanctions on them. We're going to do this and we're going to do this. And he never did. he's done almost nothing other than reduce the amount of ammunition and weapons that go to Ukraine, has disrupted intelligence sharing with Ukraine. All the pressure has been on Zelensky. And so I think European leaders would hear that Trump would say, we're 90% there, we're getting close on this. And they didn't want to do something that might derail all this because they really believed it, I think, or maybe were hoping that Trump really was going to do something that was going to actually deliver. Zero. Nothing's happened. And so now I think European leaders are realizing that the United States doesn't seem terribly interested in actually bringing about a just, sustainable outcome that doesn't almost guarantee continued conflict or millions of Ukrainian refugees coming into Europe. So they are going to have to do this themselves. They are going to have to figure out a way to ensure that Ukraine doesn't fail. Now, you started off by asking about this security guarantee. First of all, kudos to President Macron that the French have been out front for much of the time. And I know he doesn't have incredibly strong domestic support, but he's still willing to make some tough calls like that. UK, same situation. Missing is Germany and several other countries that need to be a part of this. I think that I don't believe in talking with the Russians just for the sake of talking. The Russians will talk all day long, but without any moving towards anything that's real. So, you can keep the channels open, but recognize who's on the other side.
Just to bring in because for me, this is obviously also, we talk about the strategic objectives, but I also like to consider the grand strategy because we did have the national security strategy released. Now, I know some people don't think it matters too much, but I consider it worth looking at because it gives a sense of Trump's strategic vision. And this emphasis on Europe as the primary disruptor to American interests, sort of essentially declaring a culture war in Europe as a national security crisis, right? So is there not an inherent conflict here between what Trump wants to achieve with his grand strategy of focusing on Western Hemisphere, great power politics, versus the strategic objectives of Ukraine? Because they don't seem to go together. I'm going to unpack this in a subsequent question, but do you understand what I mean? It seems very much like Europe wants to rely on the US, but the indications are just not there that it's going to follow through.
That's a great point. And you're right. You have to read the national security strategy if you want to understand how he thinks and what, in broad, big handfuls, how the U.S. intends to move forward on things. And we're seeing that strategy implemented in the Western Hemisphere now, both in action and in language. The problem for me with that national security strategy was that it made almost no mention of NATO as NATO has traditionally been the core of our security. It clearly does not have a critical role for this administration. It never mentions Russia as a threat, which is also stunning. And yes, and exactly as you pointed out, it calls, democratic countries of Europe the biggest threat, which is, none of his predecessors would recognize that or support that. So this is where I think he cedes Europe to Russia. He doesn't say, Russia, you can have Europe, but de facto, Russia is not going to get a lot of interference from the United States, is what it seems like. Garry Kasparov said, you either have a sphere of influence or you are in somebody else's sphere of influence. And this is where I think Europe, at least until we can return to something more familiar as the rules-based order with NATO and all these things, and a more traditional approach by the United States, at least for the next couple of years, Europe needs to come together. And when I say Europe, it's not just EU, I'm talking about UK, Norway, Canada as well, and Ukraine. Combine your economies, populations, wealth, technology, military. That's powerful. That's a lot. If you can work together, easier said than done, but to create your own sphere of influence.
Okay, let me pose you a sort of... Okay, on the one hand, you have, to your point, that the Trump administration wants to effectively cede Europe to the Russians and wash their hands of the longer term complications of the end game or whatever, end state of the Ukraine war. But on the other hand, to what we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which I will finally stop teasing and just ask you, the Russians are now being targeted by the United States over their shadow fleet, over various activities. They've lost critical role in Venezuela, and Iran is looking very fragile. So which is it? Is it that the Americans are going to undermine Putin's interferences and such, or are they going to give them the freedom to do so in Europe?
Well, that's a
Because it
great
seems a little
question.
bit,
That's a very
it
good
seems two
question.
ways.
I think that what we're seeing is Trump doing what he's doing, not because he all of a sudden really cares about Ukraine or Europe, but it's because it's about the Western Hemisphere. And, when you read through that strategy and you listen to this Mr. Miller's rant the other night on CNN, this is about President Trump telling Russia, get out. I mean, the original Monroe Doctrine from the early 19th century was about the United States as a new country saying to Great Britain, to the Spanish Empire and all the others, this is ours. And then, of course, we had to grow a military capability to actually implement that and do that. Now, when you read through and listen to it's about, they're not going to tolerate anybody else, our adversaries, and of course, they're talking about Russia and China, being able to come in and take oil, critical minerals, control things like the Panama Canal, etc. That's the framework. So Russia is because of the tankers that were either getting Venezuelan oil or were doing other things, supporting Venezuela. They're going to be run out of there. The U.S. Navy is actually, I was just reading today, there are 3 or 4 other ships that the U.S. Navy is pursuing out in the Atlantic. So I think this sort of, and I have to say that while I'm not a fan of this new strategy or even of this administration, I'm glad to see that they are finally enforcing sanctions and enforcing things against Russia. I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole events a week ago, which is bizarre, it's a week ago, it feels like, well, so much has happened now, over Venezuela. There's a lot of emphasis on what happens next, of course, but people look at it, I think, very binary. It's either right or wrong. And for me, obviously, I don't agree with how it was conducted in Venezuela, but I do like to see the United States being more, well, actually following through on its policy of disrupting these illicit activities with the tankers. But people sort of think it's one and the same, it's not all. But very simply, aside from all of this, a lot of people, including the most requested question for you by the audience, is what happens about Greenland? What would the EU/NATO's response best strategy be? Are we going to actually see kinetic action over Greenland? I personally don't think so. How do you see it?
Yeah, so I'm with you. I think it's unlikely that we're going to see any sort of kinetic, real military force. I think that would be a disaster for the United States. It would be the biggest own goal in the last 20 or 30 years for us if we did that, because of the damage it would do to our relationship with our allies, damage to our credibility, and for what? I mean, the Danes and the Greenlanders have said, please send your troops back. You're welcome to be here. We used to have 17 bases in Greenland, and they've said, you can do this again. And they've also indicated that certainly they're willing to have U.S. companies come in and dig for critical minerals underneath the ice. I mean, so what is it that the administration is actually after? And I think it's not security. I mean, we haven't had anybody there except this one little space station for years. So where's the big security threat? When they say that Greenland's covered with Russian and Chinese naval vessels, it's just not true. Now, as the polar ice cap continues to shrink in outlying years, there will be more activity perhaps. But this is where NATO could be proactive and say, you know what? The Americans have been helping us for a century. They bailed us out in World War I, they bailed us out in World War II, and then for 80 years after World War II, the Americans spent zillions of dollars helping to defend us and helping us recover from the war. Why don't we help America? And we're going to put some more muscle on the NATO Arctic security plans. And you get Norwegian and British and Canadian and Danish Navy and Army an air force involved in the Arctic and say, okay, we'll if it's really security, we'll help. But I think we're going to find out it's not really security. It's about demonstrating this is ours, and we don't have to ask Denmark for permission to dig because it's ours. And I think that's what's really going on here. What I hope, and I hate to use the word, but I think NATO is where this can be solved. You know, as you and many of your listeners will know, there has always been a friction between members of NATO. I mean, the French kicked us out in the 60s. Turkey and Greece are always close to something happening. Germany, very unhappy with the U.S. when we invaded Iraq in 2003. And so NATO provides a format where other nations can say, hey, United States, you don't want to lose access to bases. You don't want to lose this great intelligence network that we have. Let's find a way to avoid doing something that wrecks this alliance. And I think they will eventually.
But just to follow up on that more bluntly, what is NATO if the United States takes such a reduced role? Is it not just going to become a bit of a talking hub? I, obviously, having worked in the UN, in principle believe in what it stands for, but I'm still very critical of it right now because it is not following through on what it says. I mean, that's partially the way that it's constructed. But like, what does NATO become? Just another talking forum?
I don't think so.
But we've seen the actions with the French leading up with testing exercises in Romania late last year. It was nothing without the Americans' provision of logistics, and there are a lot of basically shortcomings that NATO has unless we build our own capacity in Europe or the NATO or the Americans.
No, that's the answer. This is what every American president has been pleading with our European allies to do, to build your own capabilities. And so this is all about political will. Look, the Germans have finally got it. They have finally figured out that they have to spend more. They have to do it. And now there's no protest in the streets. I mean, Germans get it. The Bundeswehr is going to get bigger. They're spending zillions of euro on growing the size of all their armed forces, modernizing another 80,000 troops. I mean, there's no protest out there. They have finally figured it out. Other countries are going to have to do the same. Poland, they're not confused. Romania is not confused. But the things that the U.S. has always provided are logistics, intelligence, aerial refueling, these kind of things. Other countries are going to have to step up. But let's just say for the sense of argument, for the sake of argument, the U.S. says, sorry, we're out. That's not going to happen, by the way. But let's just say they did, or we're completely committed over here somewhere else, so we don't have anything left for you. And by the way, there's only like 80,000 Americans total military in Europe. That would not come close to filling up Wembley Stadium. So it's not so much that's there. Europe can provide, if they got serious about it, almost everything except, thousands of nuclear weapons. All the other stuff, it's a matter of priority and political will. And I'm a little weary of listening to Europeans say, oh, we can't afford it, it'll take too long. Well, get on with it. I live here in Germany. I've seen no decrease in the number of people that go on ski holidays or go to Saint-Tropez or go to Zult or all the other places. The number of Mercedes and Audis and BMWs here in Frankfurt has not decreased. There is plenty of money. There's just not enough political will.
Well, I don't think you're going to see the Germans buying Citroens instead of their lovely BMWs, are you?
I hope not. I hope not.
My last question for you is simply, though, again, what aggravates me most about Europe is its lack, and I say this as I always emphasize, from a place of hard love, tough love. I want the best for Europe, but it needs to get with the times. It needs to stop behaving in wanting things to be the way it wants it to be and accepting that things are the way that they are, if that makes sense. And for example, Britain doesn't criticize the United States actions in Venezuela when it is quite clearly strenuously illegal and the incorrect thing to do. But they then provide military support. Worst of all, they didn't announce it, whilst the Americans are letting everyone know that they're doing it at the time. They provide intelligence and military assets to help with the seizure of the tanker. So which is it, England? Do you support America's operations or not? because you either need to stick with your rhetoric and follow through on that, be consistent in the narrative that your criticism, or shut up and, agree with it and whatever. Do you not understand what I mean? It's a frustration of difference between narrative and action. And I feel
Yeah,
that the Europeans get hold of that.
I can understand that, but I also, the reality is that every nation, including my own, has to balance a lot of different things, whether it's domestic concerns, regional concerns. It was not a given that the U.S. would support Great Britain in the Falklands because the Reagan administration was trying very hard to improve relationship with all of our neighbors in South America. So, I mean, that required some work for the Americans to be not support, but at least not block Great Britain UK doing what it did in the Falklands. These kind of things are not unusual where you're having to do things. You don't want to advertise everything that you are doing. Now, I will say this current administration has a real problem with talking too much about classified information and what's going on. I think it was appropriate that UK was not advertising what they were doing to support, but it highlights how much we, the U.S., depend on our allies for access and for intelligence. They could not have conducted that operation with helicopters seizing this tanker in the North Atlantic in the middle of January without support from UK. The bases that we have in Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, all of these things are important for the United States. And I worry that the approach of the administration is going to damage that. That's going to, and that will be bad for us, not just for Europe.
That's the point I've always made. The single biggest asset the United States has is its alliance network. No other country has that. And as we're seeing right now with the disintegration of the autocratic axis, if you like, Venezuela is changed, Iran is on the precipice, Russia's incredibly fragile, at least China, although China's always different. But Ben, as a final question, before we hopefully meet again in the near future, what would you encourage viewers, listeners to focus on? Where would you encourage them to look most, be it on the Ukrainian front or in the bigger strategic picture?
I would watch American domestic politics. I think that, November, of course, is our midterm election, and the Republicans know that they are in trouble. And my sense is that Republican members of Congress don't fear President Trump as much as they did last year. They're hearing from their voters, their constituents, about inflation, other prices. They see the president increasingly using military force. And so we're starting to see Republican senators come out criticizing policy in Venezuela. Several spoke out against the ridiculous aggressive language towards Denmark and Greenland. I think the administration is going to have to respond to some of these things. So that's one thing I would keep an eye on. And how does that meter, which is what's supposed to happen, in the Constitution, the Congress has an important role to play. And they didn't do it last year. I think we're going to see more of it this year.
I'd love to show you my constitution, but fun fact, Britain has never actually written one. We just have a lot of random laws. I think most people see the Magna Carta as the constitution. But anyway,
you're doing okay.
Ben Hodges, been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Do see you next time. Subscribe, like, and of course, take care out there.